My name is Emma, and I'm 28 years old. 4 weeks ago, my parents secretly sold my grandmother's antique 1892 Steinway piano, the one she promised would be mine, and used the entire $95,000 to buy my sister a brand new Mercedes-Benz. They thought my grandmother was too sick in hospice to ever find out, and they thought I was too weak and invisible to do anything about it. They were dead wrong. When I finally told my grandmother what they had done, she didn't cry or scream. She simply reached for her phone, dialed her attorney of 30 years, and set in motion a devastating plan she had been secretly crafting for 5 years. At my mother's 60th birthday party, in front of all their wealthy friends and business partners, my parents learned the hard way that they didn't actually own the house they had been living in for a decade, and that my grandmother was taking it all back. Before I tell you exactly how this explosive family secret came to light and how my parents lost everything, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you genuinely connect with this story. Also, drop a comment below letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I love seeing our amazing community from all around the world. Now, let me take you back to the afternoon where the foundation of my family began to crumble, the day my grandmother, Eleanor, was admitted to hospice. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon right after I had finished teaching my last piano lesson of the day. I was a music teacher, spending my days teaching scales and rhythm to 37 young children every week. It wasn't a glamorous or highly lucrative career like the corporate world my family thrived in, but I loved it. Eleanor had another heart attack, my father, Richard, announced over the phone. There was no greeting, no warmth, no asking if I was sitting down. She's stable, but they're moving her to hospice care, family meeting at the hospital in an hour. I dropped everything and rushed to the hospital. By the time I arrived, my parents and my younger sister, Megan, were already huddled in a corner of the sterile waiting room, speaking in hushed, urgent voices. My father stood with his arms crossed, his designer suit unwrinkled, exuding his usual commanding presence. My mother, Diane, clutched her expensive purse like a lifeline. And Megan, who was 4 years younger than me and undeniably the favorite child, was scrolling mindlessly through her phone, barely bothering to look up when I walked in. "Good, you're here," my father said, looking at me as if he were addressing an underperforming employee. Not, "How are you holding up?" Not, "This must be so hard for you." It was just pure logistics. We need to divide responsibilities. Someone needs to visit Mother daily. He didn't miss a beat. Diane and I have the business to run. We simply don't have the time. And Megan is in a highly critical phase with Daniel's family. Daniel Harrison was Megan's boyfriend of 8 months, and more importantly to my father, he was the son of my father's most lucrative and important business partner. Keeping Daniel's family impressed and happy was the absolute top priority in the Thompson household. "So, Emma," my father said, turning his calculating gaze to me, "you'll handle the daily visits. Your schedule is flexible. Music teachers don't exactly work demanding overtime." I swallowed the lump in my throat. I wanted to scream that my time had value, too. I ran after-school programs and dedicated my life to my students, but I didn't say any of that. I had spent 28 years shrinking myself to make my family comfortable. "Of course," I said quietly, "I want to be with her anyway." "Perfect," my father said, already turning away to check his watch. "Keep us updated if anything changes." As I turned and walked down the long, fluorescent-lit hallway toward my grandmother's room, I heard my mother's voice drift behind me, meant only for Megan's ears. "Well, at least she's useful for something." I didn't stop, and I didn't turn around. I had grown so used to being the invisible, unappreciated disappointment of the family that the pain was just a dull ache. But walking into my grandmother's hospice room felt like stepping into a different world. Eleanor's room smelled faintly of lavender and old books. She had insisted on bringing pieces of her home with her. She was 76 years old, dying of congestive heart failure, but her mind was as sharp as a finely tuned blade. The doctors had given her weeks, maybe a month or two if she was incredibly lucky. I visited her every single day after school. We didn't talk about my parents' coldness or Megan's wealthy boyfriend. We talked about music. We talked about her glorious years performing as a classical pianist across grand concert halls in the Northeast. One quiet evening, as the sun was setting and casting long, golden shadows across her blanket, she reached out and took my hand. Her grip was incredibly weak, but her eyes burned with a fierce, protective intensity. "Emma, I need you to know something," she said, her voice soft but unyielding. "The Steinway, my mother's piano from 1892, it's yours. I've already told Richard and Diane, that piano belongs to you." I knew that magnificent piano well. I had learned my very first scales on those slightly worn ivory keys when I was just 7 years old. That beautiful instrument had been the entire soundtrack of my childhood, and sitting on its bench was the only place in the family where I ever felt truly seen and valued. "Grandma, you don't have to do that," I whispered, tears prickling my eyes. "I want to," she insisted, squeezing my hand as tightly as she could. "You're the only one who truly understands what it means. Promise me you'll take care of it." "I promise," I said, a tear finally escaping. She smiled then, a deep, knowing smile that seemed to hold heavy, unseen secrets. "There are some things in this world far more valuable than money, child," she murmured. "And there are some people who simply need to learn that lesson the hard way." I didn't know it yet, but my grandmother was already 10 steps ahead of everyone else in the family. 2 weeks passed in a blur of hospital visits, whispered medical consultations, and the steady, terrifying beep of my grandmother's heart monitor. Despite her rapidly failing body, Eleanor's mind remained an iron vault. She asked me to stop by her house on a rainy Thursday afternoon to retrieve a box of vintage photographs and some of her original sheet music that she wanted to look at one last time. I still had my spare key, so I drove over right after my classes ended for the day. The house was unnervingly quiet when I unlocked the front door. It lacked its usual warmth, the faint scent of Earl Grey tea, and the soft hum of classical music that typically filled the halls. I walked through the familiar foyer, my wet shoes squeaking slightly against the hardwood, and made my way toward the living room. I stopped dead in my tracks. The breath was violently knocked out of my lungs. The corner of the living room, bathed in the gray afternoon light pouring through the bay windows, was entirely empty. Where the magnificent 1892 Steinway piano had stood in all its polished mahogany glory for over 3 decades, there was nothing but a large rectangular indent crushed into the carpet. It was a ghost of a legacy violently ripped away. I walked over to the empty space, my hands trembling uncontrollably. I touched the indented rug, feeling a suffocating wave of panic and grief wash over me. The piano wasn't just a piece of furniture. It was the physical embodiment of my grandmother's soul and the only inheritance I had ever wanted. Staring at that hollow space, a visceral, sickening feeling clawed at my stomach, a feeling I hadn't experienced with such intensity since I was 18 years old. The physical emptiness in the room perfectly mirrored the emotional void my parents had carved into my chest exactly 10 years ago. The memory crashed over me like a tidal wave. I was in my senior year of high school, holding an acceptance letter to one of the most prestigious music conservatories in the country. It was the culmination of years of bleeding fingertips, late-night rehearsals, and a desperate hope that if I just proved my exceptional talent, my parents would finally look at me with pride. I had walked into my father's home office, clutching the letter and the tuition breakdown, my heart hammering against my ribs. I didn't even ask for a full free ride. I simply asked if they could help me with the first semester's deposit, or perhaps co-sign a student loan so I could secure my spot. My father, Richard, didn't even bother to take his eyes off his computer screen. He took the acceptance letter, glanced at the tuition cost, and pushed it back across his mahogany desk as if it were a piece of trash. "Music is a hobby, Emma. It is not an investment," he had stated, his voice dripping with icy condescension. "I am not throwing tens of thousands of dollars into a black hole so you can sing nursery rhymes to toddlers. If you want to pursue this fantasy, you will fund it yourself. We are not a charity." I had stood there, tears blurring my vision, turning to my mother, Diane, who was lounging on the leather sofa flipping through a magazine. I begged her to understand, pleading that this was my dream, my one chance. Diane didn't even look up from her page. "Oh, stop being so dramatic, Emma. We have to be realistic about our finances. We have to prioritize the child who will actually make something of herself." The favorite child, Megan. Just 1 year later, the hypocrisy of their financial realism was put on full, blinding display. Megan, who had barely maintained a C average and showed zero ambition beyond shopping and socializing, was accepted into a private, wildly expensive university to study communications. My parents threw her a massive, catered graduation party. Richard wrote a check for her full tuition, room, and board without a single second of hesitation. And as the crowning jewel of her unearned achievements, they surprised her in the driveway with a brand new, fully loaded SUV. "She needs a safe, reliable vehicle to match her bright future," my father had beamed, handing her the keys. I was standing in the background of those celebration photos, wearing a uniform for my second minimum wage job, exhausted and drowning in high-interest loans I had been forced to sign entirely on my own. My parents hadn't just refused to pay my tuition, they had actively humiliated me for my passions while funding a life of absolute luxury for my sister. The message was permanently burned into my psyche. Megan was an investment. I was a liability. Snapping back to the present, the agonizing realization of what they had done with the piano hit me with the force of a freight train. I didn't even bother locking the front door behind me. I ran to my car, my tires screeching as I pulled out of the driveway and sped toward my parents' house across town. I slammed my fists against their heavy oak front door until my father finally opened it, holding a crystal glass of scotch, looking thoroughly annoyed by the interruption. "The piano?" I gasped, my chest heaving. "What did you do with Grandma's piano?" He didn't flinch. His expression didn't change. He simply took a slow sip of his drink and walked back into the foyer. "I sold it," he said casually, as if he were talking about a piece of old lawn furniture. "I got a buyer to take it for $95,000. It was a fantastic price, really." The world tilted on its axis. "You sold it," I shrieked, my voice echoing off their vaulted ceilings. "Grandma said it was mine. She told you it was mine." "Grandma is dying in hospice, Emma," my father sighed impatiently. "She doesn't need a piano." "And neither do you." Before I could even process the sheer audacity of his words, I heard the sharp, metallic jingle of car keys. Megan sauntered into the hallway, a smug, radiant grin plastered across her face. She was twirling a silver key fob around her manicured finger. The iconic Mercedes-Benz logo caught the light of the chandelier. "You bought her a car." My voice was a hollow whisper. I looked from the keys to my father. "You sold my grandmother's legacy to buy Megan a car." "A Mercedes-Benz, to be exact," my father corrected, completely devoid of shame. "Megan needs to make the right impression on the Harrisons. Daniel's family is very particular about appearances. We couldn't have her pulling up to their estate in her old SUV. It's a strategic investment in her future." Her future. I repeated, the bitter taste of bile rising in my throat. Megan stepped forward, swinging her new keys like a weapon. "Oh, don't be so pathetic and jealous, Emma. It's a terrible look on you," she sneered, flashing a cruel, triumphant smile. "Maybe if you had picked a real career instead of babysitting tone-deaf kids, you could afford nice things, too. You don't even have the space for a grand piano in your tiny, depressing apartment anyway." I looked at the three of them, my father with his arrogant scotch, my sister with her stolen trophy, and my mother, who had just walked into the room to stand united with them. They had built their entire lives around a twisted hierarchy where I was always the afterthought, the punching bag, the sacrifice required to fuel Megan's ego. "Does Grandma know?" I asked, my voice trembling with a terrifying, unfamiliar rage. "Does she know you sold her most prized possession?" The smugness in the room faltered for just a fraction of a second. My mother's face hardened into a mask of pure ice as she stepped forward, invading my personal space. "She is in hospice, Emma. She is on morphine half the time," Diane hissed, her voice dropping to a cold, venomous register. "She does not need to know anything that might upset her." "You mean you don't want her to know you stole from her?" I shot back, refusing to back down. My mother grabbed my wrist, her manicured fingernails digging painfully into my skin. "Listen to me very carefully," she threatened, her eyes narrowed into dark slits. "If you march into that hospital and tell her this, the shock will break her. And if her weak heart stops beating because you couldn't keep your jealous, dramatic mouth shut, you will be her murderer. Do you want to be responsible for killing your own grandmother?" The accusation hung in the air, a toxic, suffocating poison designed to paralyze me with guilt. It was the exact same manipulative tactic they had used to control me for 28 years. I looked at my mother's gripping hand, then up at her cold, calculating eyes. The old Emma, the scared, desperate girl begging for tuition money, would have crumbled and surrendered. But that girl was gone. I violently yanked my arm out of my mother's grasp. "Grandma has a right to know what happened to her legacy," I said quietly, a dangerous calm settling over my entire body. "And for the first time in my life, I am not going to protect your lies." I turned and walked out the front door, leaving them standing in their stolen luxury. I was going straight to the hospice center, and hell was coming with me. The drive from my parents' sprawling, manicured estate to the hospice center was a blur of blinding rain and suffocating anger. My knuckles were bone-white as I gripped the steering wheel, my mother's toxic threat still echoing in my ears. "Do you want to be responsible for killing your own grandmother?" For my entire life, that exact brand of emotional terrorism had kept me paralyzed. I had spent 28 years shrinking myself, desperately trying not to take up too much space, trying not to be a financial burden, and trying to survive in a family that treated my existence like a bad investment. As the windshield wipers slapped rhythmically against the glass, my sister's cruel, mocking voice replayed in my mind. "Maybe if you had picked a real career instead of babysitting tone-deaf kids, you could afford nice things, too. You don't even have the space for a grand piano in your tiny, depressing apartment." I let out a bitter, hollow laugh that caught in my throat. The sheer, blinding irony of Megan's insult was almost Shakespearean. Because my parents and my sister had absolutely no idea who I actually was. They had no idea what I had built in the dark, and they had no idea that I hadn't lived in a tiny, depressing apartment for over 3 years. To understand why I kept my life completely hidden in the shadows, you have to understand the absolute hell I walked through to build it. 10 years ago, when my father looked me in the eye and refused to co-sign my conservatory loan, while simultaneously writing a blank check for Megan's communications degree, he thought he was closing the door on my future. He thought I would quietly surrender, give up music, and get some menial corporate job to appease him. He severely underestimated my desperation and my grit. I didn't quit. Instead, I stripped my life down to the absolute bare, agonizing minimum. I took out high-interest private loans entirely on my own name, terrified of the crushing debt, but more terrified of failing. I enrolled in the conservatory and immediately took on 3 separate jobs to keep myself afloat. My 20s were not spent going to college parties, taking European vacations funded by daddy's credit card, or shopping for designer bags like my sister. My 20s were a brutal, unending grind for survival. I would wake up at 4:30 a.m. to secure a practice room in the icy university basement, shivering in a threadbare, second-hand winter coat that was 2 sizes too big. I attended rigorous classes until 3:00 p.m., then immediately ran to my first job teaching beginner piano lessons at a strip mall music store. At 8:00 p.m., I would change into a stained polyester uniform and waitress at a 24-hour diner until 2:00 in the morning. I functioned on 3 hours of sleep, fueled by stale diner coffee and sheer, unadulterated spite. I lived in a cramped, windowless basement apartment where the heater barely worked, sleeping on a mattress directly on the floor. I wore the same 3 pairs of clearance rack jeans until the thighs wore through, desperately patching the holes so I wouldn't have to spend $20 on a replacement. I ate bulk rice and canned beans, meticulously counting every single penny, terrified that one missed shift would cause my entire fragile existence to collapse. There were nights I would sit on the edge of my mattress, my fingers cramping and bleeding from practicing, completely overwhelmed by the crushing weight of the debt and the exhaustion. I would look at Megan's Instagram, seeing her posting from a yacht in Cabo or showing off a new $3,000 handbag, and I would just cry until I threw up. I bled for every single inch of ground I gained. But slowly, agonizingly, the relentless grind began to forge something unbreakable inside me. By the time I graduated at the top of my conservatory class, I didn't just want to be a performer. I had developed a unique, highly effective curriculum for childhood cognitive development through music. I started my own private teaching business out of my tiny apartment. I worked 80-hour weeks, taking every single client I could find, pouring every dime of profit right back into the business and my loans. And then it exploded. My curriculum gained incredible traction in the affluent suburbs. I hired one assistant teacher, then 2, then 5. Today, at 28 years old, I don't just babysit tone-deaf kids. I am the founder and CEO of the Rosewood Music Academy. I employ 22 instructors across 3 different upscale locations. I wiped out my crushing student debt 3 years ago. I am pulling in high 6 figures annually, entirely self-made. And that tiny, depressing apartment, Megan loves to mock. I moved out of it years ago. I now own a stunning, modern, 3-bedroom loft downtown with floor-to-ceiling windows and exposed brick. I had achieved a level of financial independence and brilliant success that completely eclipsed my father's mid-level corporate standing. I had won, but I kept it an absolute, airtight secret from my family. I maintained a P.O. box attached to my old zip code so they would never see my new address. When I attended the mandatory, suffocating family holiday dinners, I intentionally wore my oldest, most faded sweaters and drove a beat-up used sedan I kept specifically for those occasions. I played the role of the struggling, invisible music teacher perfectly. Why? Because I knew exactly who Richard and Diane Thompson were. The very second they sniffed my wealth, their narrative would instantly change. The father who called me a black hole would suddenly claim he was the mastermind behind my business acumen. The mother who called me useless would demand I fund Megan's lavish wedding or bail my father out of his bad investments. They would sink their claws into my hard-earned empire and drain it dry, all while demanding my gratitude. So, I starved them of the truth. I found my peace in the shadows, knowing my self-worth no longer required their validation. But as I pulled into the hospice center parking lot, turning off the ignition and listening to the rain hammer against the roof, that peace evaporated. My money couldn't buy back Grandma Aliner's piano. The Steinway was never about financial value to me. It was the only tangible piece of pure, unconditional love I had in that family. It was the instrument my grandmother had used to show me I mattered, and my parents had sold it like cheap firewood just so Megan could play pretend in a Mercedes-Benz. I wiped the tears from my face, my expression hardening into stone. I was done hiding in the shadows. I walked through the sliding glass doors of the hospice center, the smell of antiseptic hitting my nose. I marched straight to Aliner's room. She was awake, propped up against her pillows, watching the gray storm outside her window. "You look like you haven't slept, my Annabelle," she said softly, her sharp eyes studying my pale face. I pulled a chair close to her bed and took her fragile hand in mine. "Grandma, I have to tell you something," I whispered, my voice trembling but resolute. "And it's going to hurt." Her gaze didn't waver. She squeezed my fingers. "Then tell me." I sat in the dimly lit hospice room, the steady hum of the oxygen machine filling the silence, waiting for my grandmother's fragile heart to shatter. I had just laid out the undeniable truth. My parents had sold her treasured 1892 Steinway piano to buy a Mercedes-Benz for my sister. But Grandma Aliner didn't gasp. She didn't cry. Instead, she let out a long, slow breath, the heavy sigh of a woman who had seen the storm coming from miles away. "I knew this might happen, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice incredibly calm. "I know my son. I've watched him become this person for 40 years. I kept hoping he'd change, but I also prepared for the exact moment he wouldn't." Before I could even process what she meant, she reached for her cell phone on the bedside table. "Hand me my glasses, Emma," she instructed. With surprising dexterity, she scrolled through her contacts, tapped a name, and put the phone on speaker. 3 rings later, a deep, measured voice answered. "Eleanor, how are you feeling?" "I'm dying, Harold," my grandmother replied smoothly. "But I am entirely clear-headed, and it is time." A heavy pause hung on the line. "I understand. When?" "Sunday. Diane's 60th birthday party. At my house. I want you there. I'll have the documents prepared. Rest well, old friend." She ended the call and looked at me with a fierce, twinkling spark in her eye. She explained that Harold Jennings had been her private attorney for 30 years. For the last 5 years, she had been meticulously building a legal fortress to protect her legacy and me from my father's greed. "Go to the party on Sunday, Emma," she smiled, squeezing my hand. "Dress nicely, bring your patience, and it's time you stop hiding your own brilliance from the world." I froze. She knew. She had always known about my business. Sunday arrived with a pale, crisp winter sun. My parents were pulling out all the stops for my mother's 60th birthday party. The house, the sprawling estate they had lived in for 10 years, acting as if they owned it, was buzzing with over 50 guests. There were catered hors d'oeuvres, a string quartet playing in the foyer, and a guest list packed with my father's wealthy business associates, including his most vital partner, James Harrison, and his son, Daniel. I walked through the front doors wearing a sharply tailored navy blue designer suit. I hadn't driven my beat-up decoy sedan today. I had pulled up in my sleek, custom Audi, though I parked it down the street to avoid immediate questions. The living room drew my eye instantly. The corner where the Steinway had stood for 30 years was glaringly empty. My mother had placed a massive, ridiculous potted fern there to cover the literal and metaphorical hole in the room. My mother, Diane, stood near the fireplace in a ruby-red gown, soaking in the attention. My father hovered nearby, aggressively networking, while Megan clung to Daniel Harrison's arm, dripping in new jewelry. An hour into the event, my father tapped his crystal champagne flute with a silver spoon. The ambient chatter of the affluent crowd died down as he took center stage in the living room. "Thank you all for being here to celebrate my beautiful wife, Diane," Richard boomed, wrapping an arm around my mother. The crowd offered warm applause. "But today, we are also celebrating the incredible trajectory of our family. As many of you know, our youngest daughter, Megan, is moving into a very critical phase of her life with Daniel." He offered a deferential nod to James Harrison. "To ensure she starts this new chapter on the right foot, Diane and I decided to make a strategic investment in her future," my father continued, his chest puffed out with arrogant pride. "We decided to clear out some dusty, unused furniture, an old piano that was just taking up space, to fund something she actually deserves." He gestured grandly toward the large bay windows. Outside in the circular driveway sat the gleaming, silver Mercedes-Benz, complete with a massive red bow on the hood. The crowd oohed and awed. Megan squealed, posing dramatically. I stood near the back of the room, my face a mask of stone. "Of course," Megan chimed in, her voice amplified in the quiet room as she suddenly locked eyes with me. She couldn't resist twisting the knife. "Some people in this family don't understand the value of real success. Right, Emma?" The crowd parted slightly, turning their gazes to me. "It's a shame you're still just babysitting toddlers for hourly wages," Megan sneered, drunk on the attention. "Maybe if you had any real ambition, Dad would buy you a car, too. But I guess teaching little music lessons doesn't exactly yield a return on investment." My father chuckled patronizingly. "Now, Megan, be kind to your sister. We can't all be high achievers. Someone has to work the small jobs." I took a slow sip of my sparkling water. I was just about to speak when a booming voice cut through the tension. "Babysitting, small jobs." James Harrison, the billionaire real estate tycoon and my father's most crucial business partner, stepped forward from the crowd. He was staring at me with an expression of absolute astonishment. He ignored my father entirely and walked straight up to me, extending his hand. "Good God, I thought I recognized you when you walked in," Mr. Harrison said, his voice echoing in the dead-silent room. "You're Emma Thompson, the founder and CEO of Rosewood Music Academy. My father's patronizing smile instantly froze. James, what are you talking about? Emma just teaches piano at a strip mall. A strip mall? Mr. Harrison barked a laugh, looking at my father like he was a complete idiot. Richard, are you out of your mind? Your daughter's cognitive development curriculum is completely revolutionizing early childhood education on the East Coast. My own grandchildren have been on the wait list for her academy for 2 years. I just read the Forbes feature on her company's multi-million-dollar expansion last month. The entire room collectively gasped. The silence that followed was suffocating. Megan's jaw literally dropped, her eyes darting between me and the billionaire who was currently looking at me like royalty. My mother's wine glass paused halfway to her mouth, her face draining of all color. Forbes! My father choked out, his perfectly curated composure violently shattering. He stared at me, his mind desperately trying to reconcile the invisible, struggling daughter he had mocked with the multimillionaire CEO standing in his living room. Emma, is this true? You own a multi-million-dollar company. I do, I said, my voice smooth, calm, and carrying effortlessly across the room. I wiped out the student loans you refused to help me with 3 years ago. I currently employ 22 people, and I own a penthouse downtown. I offered my father a razor-sharp smile. I just didn't tell you, Richard, because I knew the second you found out I had money, you would try to take credit for it, or worse, ask me to fund Megan's lifestyle. The guests began whispering fervently, Mr. Harrison looked at my father with sudden, intense disgust, realizing the horrifying family dynamic at play. My father desperately scrambled to save face in front of his investors. Well, we raised her to be fiercely independent. He stammered, sweating profusely. This is a family of immense success. We own this beautiful estate, after all. Actually, a new, authoritative voice rang out from the back of the room. Everyone turned. Harold Jennings stepped out of the shadows, his worn leather briefcase in hand. He walked to the center of the room, standing exactly where the Steinway piano used to be. Since we are on the topic of investments and ownership, Harold said, his voice cold as ice. I am Harold Jennings, a Leaner's attorney, and Richard, you do not own this estate. In fact, you don't own much of anything at all. The silence in the living room was so profound that you could hear the ice melting in the guests' cocktail glasses. Harold Jennings stood dead center in the space where my grandmother's Steinway had rested for 30 years, holding his worn leather briefcase like an executioner's block. My mother has an attorney. Since when? My father stammered, his voice cracking. The deep, booming authority he had wielded just 10 minutes ago had completely vanished. Since 30 years ago, Richard, Harold's tone was polite, but it cut through the room like a scalpel. I also represented your late father. You would know this if you had ever bothered to ask her. My mother, Diane, stepped forward, her face flushed with a desperate, frantic anger. Eleanor is dying. She is heavily medicated and not in her right mind. Whatever fraudulent papers you have in that briefcase. Harold raised a single, silencing hand. I visited Eleanor this morning. Her hospice physician and her charge nurse signed affidavits confirming she is fully competent, lucid, and acting of her own free will. She dictated specific instructions for today's meeting. Harold unlatched his briefcase and withdrew a crisp, heavily stamped folder. I understand there has been some severe confusion about property ownership in this family, so let me clarify. He held up a legal document for the front row of wealthy guests to see. This is the deed to the estate we are currently standing in. Notice the name on the deed, Eleanor Whitmore, not Richard Thompson. Not Diane Thompson. I watched the last remnants of color drain from my father's face. He grabbed the back of a dining chair to steady himself. This house has never been transferred. It was never gifted, Harold continued, his voice ringing out. For 10 years, you have lived here rent-free at Eleanor's generosity. Legally, you are merely tenants at will, and the property owner has the right to terminate that arrangement at any time. This is a joke, Megan shrilled, grabbing Daniel Harrison's arm and looking around wildly. Dad, tell them this is a joke. Tell them we own this house. My father couldn't even look at her. He was staring at the deed in Harold's hand as if it were a loaded gun. "That is just the beginning," Harold stated, pulling a second, thicker document from the folder. 5 years ago, Eleanor established a separate, irrevocable trust. This trust was created specifically to protect her most valuable assets in the event of financial misconduct by her family members. The trust includes this property, her financial accounts, and all items of significant sentimental value, specifically including the 1892 Steinway piano. Harold looked up, his gaze bypassing my parents and settling directly on me. "And per the terms of this trust, the sole, exclusive beneficiary is Emma Thompson." The room erupted into shocked whispers. Megan let out an ear-piercing shriek of absolute fury. "What? That is fraud. She manipulated an old, dying woman." "That little." "Megan, I would advise you to choose your next words very carefully," Harold interrupted, his voice turning to ice. "Everything said here today has been witnessed by over 50 people, including several prominent legal professionals." Harold let the chaos settle for a fraction of a second before delivering the fatal blow. "Regarding the piano sale, since the Steinway was an explicit asset of the trust, and Emma is the designated beneficiary, your sale of the piano without the trustees' consent constitutes an unauthorized disposal of trust assets. In legal terms, it is misappropriation of property. Fraud." "What does that mean?" my mother whispered, her hands shaking violently. "It means the $95,000 must be returned to the trust in full," Harold stated, his gaze sweeping across my terrified parents. "Failure to comply will result in immediate civil litigation, and given the clear paper trail, I assure you the outcome will not be favorable. I also feel obligated to remind you that Pennsylvania law takes property fraud quite seriously. Representing someone else's property as your own to secure business deals can have significant criminal consequences." At the word criminal, James Harrison stepped backward, physically distancing himself from my father. "We don't have $95,000 sitting around in cash." My father practically screamed, the panic fully overtaking him. "The money went to the car." "Then I suggest you find a way to liquidate that asset," Harold replied calmly, nodding toward the bay window where the Mercedes-Benz sat in the driveway. "The dealership might accept a return, though you will undoubtedly take a significant financial loss." "My car, you're taking my car," Megan wailed, the mask of the spoiled, untouchable golden child completely dissolved, leaving behind a frantic, hysterical mess. She turned to her boyfriend, grabbing his tuxedo jacket. "Daniel, do something. Tell your dad to help us. You can't let them take my car." Daniel Harrison looked at Megan as if he were seeing her for the very first time. The illusion of the wealthy, graceful socialite was shattered. In her place was a lying, entitled fraud whose family was on the brink of criminal charges. Daniel's father, James, leaned in and whispered sharply into his son's ear. Daniel gently but firmly peeled Megan's hands off his jacket. "Megan, we're done," he said, his voice laced with pure disgust. "My family doesn't associate with frauds. Don't ever call me again." "Daniel, wait, please." Megan sobbed, chasing him as he and his father turned their backs and walked straight out the front door. The most prized relationship of her life, her ticket to high society, was gone in a matter of seconds, evaporating along with her stolen Mercedes. With his most critical business partner walking out the door, the empire my father had built on borrowed prestige collapsed into ash. The guests were already murmuring, setting down their drinks and rushing to the exits to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout. My father's pride completely shattered. He stumbled forward, ignoring the fleeing guests, and threw himself in front of me. The arrogant, condescending man who had mocked my career just an hour ago was now shaking, his eyes wide with desperate terror. Emma, please," Richard begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched plea. He reached out as if to grab my hands, but I took a cold step back. "You have to stop this. You're a CEO, you have money, you don't need the $95,000. If Harold files those papers, I'll be ruined. James just walked out, my company will go under. Emma, I'm your father, I'm begging you." My mother rushed to his side, tears streaming down her face, her designer makeup running in dark, ugly streaks. "Emma, please, we are your family. You can't throw us out on the street. You can't take Megan's car, it will destroy her. We're sorry, okay? We're so sorry." I looked at the two of them, reduced to groveling, panicked messes in the center of a house they didn't even own. I felt no pity. I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, clear sense of justice. "Family," I repeated, my voice eerily calm, echoing in the now mostly empty room. "You didn't care about family when you refused to help me with my tuition. You didn't care about family when you mocked my apartment and my career. And you certainly didn't care about family when you sold a dying woman's legacy to buy a luxury car." I looked my mother dead in the eyes. "You told me that if I told Grandma the truth about the piano, I would be a murderer. You tried to weaponize my love for her to protect your own greed." I stepped around them, adjusting my blazer. "You aren't sorry for what you did to me, or to Grandma. You're just sorry you finally got caught. You have 30 days to return my money, Richard. I highly suggest you call the dealership." As the last of the wealthy guests practically sprinted out the front door to escape the radioactive fallout of my family's exposed lies, the sprawling house grew suffocatingly quiet. The caterers had discreetly slipped out the back. The string quartet had packed up their instruments long ago. In the center of the grand living room, my father sat heavily on the edge of the sofa, his head buried in his hands. My mother stood frozen by the fireplace, her designer mascara running in thick, dark tracks down her pale cheeks. Outside, through the bay window, Megan was slumped against the front tire of the doomed Mercedes-Benz, sobbing uncontrollably. They looked completely and utterly broken. For 28 years, I had been conditioned to rush in and fix their discomfort. Whenever my parents were upset, whenever the family peace was threatened, it was my job to shrink myself, apologize, and absorb their stress. A small, deeply ingrained part of my inner child felt a twinge of instinct to comfort them, to tell them everything was going to be okay. Another, more vindictive part of me wanted to twist the knife to scream at them for every single time they had made me feel worthless. But I didn't do either. I simply stood next to Harold Jennings, feeling a profound, unshakable sense of calm wash over my entire body. I didn't need to destroy them, and I didn't need to save them. For the first time in my life, I was entirely detached from their emotional chaos. Harold cleared his throat, pulling a fresh stack of documents from his leather briefcase. He laid them out meticulously on the mahogany dining table. "Emma," he said quietly, ensuring only I could hear. "Legally, we hold all the cards. You have the right to demand an immediate eviction." Given their fraudulent disposal of trust assets, the authorities could have them out of this property by the end of the week. Eleanor would support whatever you decide. I looked across the room at the people who shared my blood. Total destruction is exactly what Richard and Diane Thompson would have chosen if the roles were reversed. They would have crushed me without a second thought. But that wasn't who I was. I refused to let their toxicity poison my character. I was going to secure my grandmother's legacy, but I was going to do it with the grace they completely lacked. "I'm not going to throw you out on the street today," I announced. My voice was steady, even, and devoid of anger. My father's head snapped up, a desperate, pathetic glimmer of hope flashing in his bloodshot eyes. "Emma, thank you, we can fix this. We can go to counseling, we're still a family." "Stop," I commanded, holding up a single hand. The word cracked through the room like a whip, and my father instantly fell silent. "We are not fixing this, Richard, because there is nothing left to fix," I stated, stepping toward the dining table. "I am not doing this to repair our relationship. I am doing this because I refuse to become the kind of ruthless person you are. So, here are my terms, and they are absolutely non-negotiable." I looked down at the paperwork Harold had prepared, perfectly aligned with the boundaries I had decided upon. "Earlier, I said you had 30 days to return the $95,000 you stole from my grandmother," I continued. "I am officially giving you 90 days. That gives you exactly 3 months to liquidate that Mercedes-Benz, sell whatever luxury watches you need to part with, and wire the funds directly into Harold's trust account. If the account is short by a single dollar on day 91, Harold files the civil litigation and the criminal fraud reports. Period. My mother let out a jagged sob, clutching her chest, but I didn't look away. Secondly, I said, tapping the thickest document on the table, you do not own this house. You have never owned this house. Starting tomorrow morning, you are officially my tenants. You will sign this formal lease agreement today. You will pay fair market rent, you will cover all utilities, and you will pay the property taxes. If you miss a single payment, you will be evicted. Emma, please, my mother wept, stumbling forward. This is our home. We've lived here for a decade. You can't treat us like strangers. You treated me like a stranger my entire life, Diane, I replied, my voice chillingly calm. This is a business transaction. Treat it as such. I took a deep breath, delivering the final, immovable boundary. Lastly, when my grandmother inevitably passes away, you will have exactly 12 months to vacate this property. That is a full year to find a new place to live and pack up your things. After that, I am moving into my house. My father stared at me, his mouth opening and closing as he searched for a loophole, a manipulation, or a guilt trip that could save him. You're taking everything, he whispered hoarsely. You're tearing this family apart over money. No, I corrected him softly. You tore this family apart over money a decade ago when you refused to invest in my future. I am just finally closing the account. I gestured to the pen resting on the table. Sign the lease, Richard, or start packing your bags tonight. With trembling, defeated hands, my father walked to the table and signed his name. My mother followed, her signature practically illegible through her tears. Outside, Megan was still crying, completely oblivious to the fact that her parents had just signed away the last illusion of their empire. I didn't stick around for goodbyes. I didn't offer a hug, and I didn't ask for an apology. I simply turned around, walked out the front door, and drove straight back to the hospice center. When I walked into Grandma Aliner's room, the evening light was fading, casting the space in a soft, peaceful dusk. She was awake, and the moment she saw my face, she knew exactly what had happened. I sat on the edge of her bed, the adrenaline finally leaving my system, replaced by an overwhelming sense of profound relief. I held her fragile hand and told her everything, about Mr. Harrison discovering my business, about Harold's flawless execution, and about the lease agreement they had just signed. Aliner smiled, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. You didn't destroy them, she whispered proudly. You gave them time. I did, I nodded, a single tear slipping down my cheek. Because you taught me that true strength isn't about hurting people who hurt you. It's about having the power to walk away. She squeezed my hand, her breathing slow and labored, but her spirit brighter than ever. You don't need their validation anymore, my sweet Emma. You never did. You built a magnificent life all on your own. I am so incredibly proud of you. Sitting there in the quiet hospice room, listening to the gentle hum of the machines, I realized she was entirely right. For 28 years, I had viewed my self-worth through the warped, toxic lens of my parents' approval. I had let them convince me I was a bad investment. But as I looked at my grandmother, I finally understood that my value was never up for negotiation. I didn't need their applause, I didn't need their money, and I didn't need their fake love. I had set my boundaries. I had protected my peace. And for the very first time in my life, I was entirely, undeniably free. It's been a full year since that explosive 60th birthday party. Grandma Aliner passed away peacefully a few months later, holding my hand, knowing her legacy was completely secure. As for my parents, they managed to liquidate the Mercedes-Benz, taking a massive financial hit, and desperately wired the $95,000 into Harold's trust account on day 89. They didn't last the full 12 months in the house. The humiliation of being exposed in front of their social circle, combined with the loss of Mr. Harrison's business, forced them to downsize to a modest condo across town. Megan is taking the city bus now, working an entry-level marketing job, and finally learning what it means to actually earn a paycheck. We don't speak, not out of anger, but simply because there is nothing left to say. I eventually moved into my grandmother's house. I used a portion of the return trust money to buy a beautiful new Yamaha grand piano, and it sits perfectly in the corner where her 1892 Steinway used to be. It's different, but it's mine. I'm sitting at that piano as I finish recording this story. And if you are watching this, if you have made it this far into the video, I am speaking directly to you right now. I know exactly how many of you are watching this feeling completely trapped. You've been told you are a burden. You've been conditioned to shrink yourself, to apologize for taking up space, and to play the supporting character in the Golden Child's movie. You've been made to feel that if you just sacrifice a little more, you will finally earn their love. Listen to me very carefully. Your worth is not defined by people who are too blind to see it. Blood does not entitle anyone to your peace, your finances, or your sanity. You are allowed to walk away from toxic dynamics. You are allowed to build a magnificent empire in the dark and keep the keys to yourself. True family isn't just about genetics. It is about who respects your boundaries, who protects you when you are vulnerable, and who genuinely celebrates your light. My grandmother taught me that you don't have to set yourself on fire just to keep your family warm. I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to set a hard, unyielding boundary with a toxic family member? Have you ever been the invisible child who finally realized their own worth and fought back? Drop your story in the comments below. Not only does it help push this video out in the YouTube algorithm so others can find it, but more importantly, your comment might be the exact lifeline someone else needs to read today to realize they aren't alone. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button to support the channel, and subscribe so you never miss another story of surviving, rebuilding, and thriving. Check the description for the next video I highly recommend you watch. Until next time, protect your peace, know your worth, and keep building your empire.